Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and I'm going on a long journey of trying to complete every single Game Boy Advance game in North America. This is the story of the highs, the lows, and all the silly stuff in between for the Game Boy Advance completion experience. This is GB Ace. Game number 9, Dungeons & Dragons: Eye of the Beholder. Okay guys, let's see a show of hands here. Who here has played Dungeons & Dragons? Well, I can assure you that my hand was definitely not raised after I asked that question, so this should be a very interesting experience. Now, even though I haven't played D&D, I am very familiar with the concept, and have at the very least engaged in playing the board game Hero Quest with my friend Odinspec, a game that could be considered a very simplified version of Dungeons & Dragons. Plus, I've also watched a few episodes and sessions of the stream series Critical Role as well, so again, I definitely get and understand the idea. How does the game transfer over to a video game installment though? Well, let's find out in Dungeons & Dragons: Eye of the Beholder, first released on the Game Boy Advance on November 7th, 2002, and developed by Pronto Games and published by Infogrames. So, interestingly enough, this is not the only Eye of the Beholder game that exists. Eye of the Beholder was also released on PC and even the SNES as well, but that game was developed by Westwood, and if you were to examine the two versions together, you'd see that they are both very different games. This Eye of the Beholder is an RPG dungeon crawler where you create a team of warriors and lead them through a massive labyrinth of enemies, traps, and treasures on a quest to get your heroes to the end of this campaign. And every time you engage in battle with the enemy, the gameplay turns into a turn-based tactical strategy game, much like you would see in games like Advance Wars or Fire Emblem. Which, hey, that seems like my cup of tea, doesn't it? Well, we'll see about that. Let's very quickly move back to the Dungeons & Dragons aspect of this game first, though, shall we? For those who are unaware, try to think of Dungeons & Dragons not as a game by itself, but more of a guideline or a book of rules of sorts. All the stuff in the game, like the scenarios, the characters, the storylines, those are customly created by those who are playing the game, or designing the game if you're the dungeon master. The actual D&D stuff comes into play with how things actually play out in the game. In other words, the players are the ones who make the decisions, strategies, and stories, but whether they actually play out in the way they want, well, that's in the hands of the dice. So try to look at Eye of the Beholder as a custom D&D campaign, with the dungeon master being the game itself. You create all the characters, you decide what their stats and general makeup will be, you of course decide how your party will progress, and your goal is to simply make it to the end of the game and the story. That's really all there is to it, and honestly, from this perspective, this prospect did really intrigue and interest me. I had not heard too many good things about this game, but a part of me felt like that could be just from those who did not have a lot of experience with D&D in the first place. And given I didn't either, but I at least had a general understanding of it, and this game is typically a genre I can thrive under, so I went into this with some very decently adequate hopes. As far as the story is concerned, the peaceful city of Waterdeep is under attack by the evil Undermountain factions led by the Guild of Xanathar. The Lord of Waterdeep, Pirgeron the Palidinson, a name that I still can't take seriously whatsoever, recruits a number of adventurers, basically your party, to investigate the sewers and beyond to eliminate this threat and evil entity caused by this guild. And with that, I decided to create my team of 4 characters. I think I could have technically created 6, but I stuck with 4 just so I'd have one of each general class. It's okay though if you undershoot, because there are generic default characters you can add to your team if you don't feel like creating anyone else, and you can also recruit other characters during your quest, so you'll never be screwed out of a max party capacity. My crew of motley warriors consisted of Slimbo the Fighter, John Pieces the Rogue, Rain the Cleric, and Jaguar, in all caps, the Wizard. In addition to the names, classes, and portraits, though, there are a lot of other things you have to set when making a new character. The race of the character, the gender of the character, their alignment, rolling for their stats, giving them skills and traits. It's a lot to manage, and the worst part is, the game doesn't really even explain much of what any of these do either. If you have the manual, or at least a way to access the manual, you can use that for a little bit of the information, but even then, there's still a lot to cover, and at the very beginning of the game, it's hard to really know what will even be beneficial for you or your characters in question. Heck, in various guides I looked up for this game, many of the traits, skills, and even magic spells were recommended to just ignore, because there is usually something else that exists that is much better that you should put all of your stock into instead. In other words, a lot of what is included here is featured just because it's a part of D&D, and not because it's a useful thing to go for in this game. And honestly, that is a bit of a shame because it makes the game appear more ambitious and grandiose than it actually is. However, I suppose a handheld Game Boy Advance game going that deep was perhaps a fool's dream to begin with. Anyway, let's talk about our classes here. Fighters are obviously the frontline units. They'll be the ones putting in the most damage and taking the most damage in return. They should be built strong with a lot of strength, defense, and HP to make sure they last the long game, since they'll likely be doing all the attacking. Rogues are more like utility classes, but they can be built as strong attackers too, just be careful of their low HP and defenses. Their main draw is that they'll generally be able to build their skills more diversely than many of the other classes, since they get more skill points on each level up. You should focus on building them with some of the more non-combat necessities, like trap disarming and lockpicking, since those skills can come in handy in a pinch if you need to make progress and mitigate damage from map hazards. Clerics are your healers, so they'll be around for healing your other characters if they need it during battle, but they also have a useful skill of being able to destroy all undead enemies in battle just by praying for their extermination. It doesn't always work, and only works on specific types of enemies, but can be a good way to speed things up if you're tired of the constant battling on certain floors. And lastly, wizards are your spellcasters. Magic is very interesting because you can only use spells a certain number of times per session, and can only recharge the spells if you successfully rest on the field. Spells are another great way of not just dealing a lot of damage, but also dealing great damage to large groups of enemies later in the game. You have to level up to obtain these super strong advanced level spells though, but they are more than worth raising a wizard to that level just to see how powerful they can be. And if it wasn't obvious, try to keep your clerics and wizards behind your physical fighters just so they don't get targeted and ganged up on. In addition to leveling up the abilities of each of these classes, you can also put multiple points into various class points and make a character a hybrid of sorts. I wouldn't personally recommend this, as while the thought of a character being able to utilize factors of each class is quite intriguing, you also miss out on some of the biggest strengths of each class by not maximizing their potential. Stuff like multiple attacks for fighters and multicasting for wizards, for example. In my personal opinion, I'd recommend a team composition of 2 fighters, a rogue, a cleric, and 2 wizards. This comp gives a lot of damage possibilities, puts 2 strong classes in front to protect the squishier members, and late game when you have magic, your 2 wizards will absolutely be destroying everything around you. But that's just my personal angle anyway. I'm sure any team comp could potentially work to some degree. Anyway, with all the basics out of the way, we're finally ready to start the game, so let's get things moving with our very first battle. One! Okay, I got absolutely destroyed here. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe my team was just weaker because I didn't have all my equipment put on yet, and the enemies just got incredibly lucky rolls to really take me down. But damn, after seeing this, any confidence and excitement I had for this game dropped down to tremendously low levels. Thankfully, the second attempt went a whole lot better, and after I took out the baddies, I was finally on the road to progressing through this game. As I explored the first floor, I did some more battles, got some items to slightly better equip my characters, and I quickly learned that you could rest on the map whenever you needed to restore your health and magic. There's no limitation to this, and it's also how you save your game as well, so try to take advantage of this as much as you can. Be careful though, because while this is essentially free, there are drawbacks to doing this. Sometimes if you rest, you might get surprise attacked by enemies instead, and you won't get any benefits from your healing. It's frustrating that this happens, especially if your characters are already close to death as it is, so try not to save your rests until the last minute, only if it seems like you're starting to run low on magic or other resources, or if, you are in a safe zone. As I explored the next few floors, I did discover a couple of other things as well. So I apologize if this summary starts to get a little disjointed. It's difficult for a game like this. I eventually discovered a safe zone where I was able to hide and get away from enemy units for a while. Not only that, this place was also kind of like a town of sorts, so I could go around and get some flavor text from the people here, buy some equipment from the different shops, and use a healer to restore any party members that got knocked out and killed. Around this point, I also ran into two NPCs that actually decided to join my party. The first person I met was Knucklebone, a female wizard who basically took the back lines with Jaguar and Rain to use magic. I tried to also give her a bow to use as an alternate damage source if she ran out of magic, but I swear it seemed like whenever I used the bow, she missed every single time. So eventually I decided to just get rid of it and focus harder on magic. Then, when I was exploring floor 2, I found a random set of rooms that looked like a prison of sorts, and after using a silver key that I found, I unlocked a door and freed Bear, who ended up being another recruitable character. This guy was a fighter, and hey, with the addition of this person, I had a full team with a very desirable team composition. 2 fighters, 2 utility units, and 2 mages. How about that? But yeah, not much to say beyond that. There were a lot of skeletons on the second floor, which means I could use Rain's ability to remove the undead and end the fight immediately, which was pretty nice, not gonna lie. I also eventually started leveling up as well, which, yeah, your characters do get stronger in this game, thank God. You'll mostly notice the strength in just your HP though, but you do get the ability to add or further develop your skills, traits, and stats as well, depending on what level your character reaches. They can only level up 6 times though, so try to make the most of your decisions. Of major note, leveling up my wizards gave them the ability to learn additional magic spells and potentially use more spells in general, something I did like and appreciate. One of the best early game spells, and honestly probably just one of the best magic spells in the entire game in general, was the spell Magic Missile. Which, yeah, this spell has great claims to fame in the D&D scene, and now I know why it's so blessed. This spell generates a generally weak magic blast that can attack any enemy in vision range, and has pretty decent accuracy as well, in addition to no enemy being immune to it unless it's a special case. But more than that, the more you level up your wizards, you'll actually gain additional casts of this spell, and I think it's the only spell that works like this. So even though one blast of Magic Missile doing 5 HP of damage may not seem like much in the mid-game, when you have a higher level wizard casting one spell with 3 missile charges, that's about 10 to 15 guaranteed damage instead, and you can easily get more Magic Missile slots as well because it's an early game spell. Trust me, I used the spell a lot because of how good and efficient it was. Even in the endgame, it was seriously that based. Oh, and on the subject of leveling up, be careful with button mashing during level up screens, because I did accidentally give Bear a cleric level up instead of a fighter one, because I wasn't paying attention. However, this ended up not being the worst case scenario, as it did give him some slight healing potential, not to mention the ability to also use the undead removal skill that Rain had. I think I still would have preferred a full fighter, but having a second semi-healer did give me a little relief during the first half of the game. Eventually we made it to floor 3, and while I was exploring, we ran into a pesky jackal wizard named Albric, who engaged us in a fight. He had a lot of enemies alongside him too, but I was shocked and relieved that I was able to take them down pretty easily with my abilities and team. Eventually it was just Albric by himself, and although he wasn't doing much to me, I was actually not doing anything to him. Literally 95% of my attacks were not landing, and whenever they did, I ended up doing 0 damage to the guy, which had me very, very concerned. Eventually, I did notice 1 or 2 of my characters got some attacks in, so I knew beating him was possible, but I was just not understanding why he was being so evasive. Is it really just because he's a boss or something? I later found out that the reason I was able to only do specific damage to him with certain characters was because of enhanced weapons. Essentially, you may notice that some weapons will have a +1, +2, or +3 attributes next to their names. This means that these weapons are blessed, apparently, and only these types of weapons can do damage to Albric. So it's just a matter of making sure you go into the fight with your physical fighters using these tools. If not, well, safe to say you might be restarting some progress. Just saying. Thankfully, it didn't come down to that for me. Even with this knowledge, though, I was still missing a ton of my attacks, so it still took a while. It did feel really good to see him finally go down, though, just because that meant I didn't have to redo anything. At that point, I decided to end my first stream session of this game, and in between sessions, I looked for some more information about it, mainly just pages on GameFAQs. I did find some guides that were actually pretty helpful, including a guide that had text-based maps that would help point to very important things of interest, and did actually have something I needed for progression. And it was actually kind of stupid because one of the items I needed was behind an invisible wall that you wouldn't have known about unless you just happened to try and move through it. Yeah, they really tried to pull out all the stops for this game, huh? I also found descriptions for all the traits, skills, and spells as well, which also helped alongside the manual. The one thing I didn't or couldn't get information for, though, were the equipment. There are a lot of weapons in this game, but due to the unique way D&D works, it's not as simple as this weapon is stronger than this weapon, or this class can only use weapons of this type. You kind of just have to equip weapons and see how they play out. There are some differences, like some have higher critical hit chances, or the die being rolled may have a different number of sides to determine your attack and power, but the game itself doesn't really tell you those factors. Lists exist of each weapon and armor stats, but I couldn't really determine much from those descriptions. Another case of someone with D&D experience might be able to translate this, but I sure as hell couldn't. I still felt like I learned a lot despite this hang-up though, so I went to the next stream a little optimistic at least. Unfortunately though, this session went a lot less smoothly. I did make some decent progress and managed to clear both floor 4 and 5, but my god, I hated floor 5. At least this floor had another save zone where you could talk with more NPCs and buy some more items without going all the way back down to floor 1, but the main monster type you had to fight on this floor were spiders, and these spider enemies sucked. They had a lot of HP, they were very evasive, and they had an annoying web attack that would force you to stay stuck in place for a couple of turns, and moving your units around was already kind of a chore in this game. The worst part of this experience, though, was at one point I ended up in a battle with a group of these enemies, and I kid you not, this one battle lasted 20 to 30 minutes. And it's just because my characters could not hit for crap. The spiders couldn't really either, but they were still hitting more often, and I got really scared I was going to team wipe here because so many of my characters got dangerously low for health. Thank God Bear was kind of a second healer, as that little cleric level up misclick did actually come in handy here for keeping my team alive. But seriously now, just look at this bullcrap. But yeah, this was the most frustrating part of the game for me, and I was convinced that I was doing something wrong with my team build, but it's not like the game was telling me what or why, so I didn't really know how I should be proceeding. I finally managed to win the battle after finally getting some hits in, but even later on I was having spider trouble again because I kept getting assaulted by more of them on the map, even when trying to rest and heal. It was not fun at all, and I still had half of the game left to do. In between sessions, I actually talked to my friend Odinspec, who did actually have some experience with D&D, and let me tell you, this was the wisest decision I made in the entire playthrough. And honestly, he didn't really even give me too much information, but the pearls of wisdom he did give were very helpful. He finally informed me about the enhanced or blessed weapons just naturally being better than the regular ones, and he also suggested just building my front lines more tanky and battle-oriented and just focusing on magic with my magic squad, taking off their equipment to improve their accuracy, since extra layers do add accuracy penalties. I also learned about flanking too, where if you have 2 units sandwiching another unit, your odds of getting attacks in actually increases a bit. Which, it didn't come up too often, since a lot of the battles kind of forced me into a 2-unit choke point anyway, but still, it was good to know to at least somewhat speed things up. With this new info, I jumped into the next session, and my god, a new confidence lifted up within me. Even just that one equipment alteration made a world of difference, and I managed to not only clear floors 6 and 7, but also floor 8 as well. I was flying through the second half of this game. During this session, I also learned that you didn't have to specifically target magic spells on top of enemies if they had an area of effect. You could also just target an empty square that was adjacent to enemies to potentially mitigate the spells hitting your own allies in the spell's AoE, which was very important because I was starting to learn a lot of spells that had very wide ranges, but since the enemies always charged straight at me, the risk of hitting my team was always there. Now, I didn't have to worry about that as much, and it was pretty nice, and also sped up things quite considerably. I was still using Magic Missile, but I also found some good use out of the moves Snillock's Snowswarm, Agonazar's Scorcher, Fireball, and Thunderbolt. Scorcher and Thunderbolt weren't as useful as the other two, since it hit units in a row, which means the wizards would not only need to be in front, but would also need a line of units ahead of them to make the most of it. But whenever those scenarios did come up, they were pretty helpful and added some nice options for me. My fighters were also becoming more helpful once they hit level 6, as that gave them the ability to use multi-attack. Basically a skill that allows 2 hits in 1 turn, and trust me, with how many misses will happen in this game, the more attacks the better. JP didn't get too many extra noteworthy additions, but he always had a knack for getting critical hits, it seemed like, so he was always good for sneaking into the front lines and dealing some nice damage when needed. Rain kinda fell off after a while though, never really getting anything significant aside from just more healing, which, don't get me wrong, still very helpful, but nothing noteworthy that she didn't already have. But yeah, things were actually going pretty well now. Some interesting things did happen every now and then, though. I'm not sure if this was a problem with the ROM of this game or the emulator I was using, but it got to a point where my game started crashing a lot when faced off against a certain enemy, and if that enemy used a certain move that would quite literally crash the game, forcing me to reset. Thankfully I didn't lose much progress during these crashes, but still, it did slow me down a little bit. On the subject of slowing, I also ran into Albric again, that little boss weasel we faced before that dodged like 100 of my attacks before I finally knocked him out. Now, with more game knowledge though, he went down super easy, and yeah, I felt pretty good about being able to finish this game. The game did throw a very interesting curveball though, when the game would no longer progress to the next floor, and instead we had to locate a guy that I had to bring back to floor 5, who would tell one of the other guys in the safe area to unlock a portal that would take me to floor 9. Weird instance of backtracking, but at least they gave me a shortcut portal to return to, so I didn't have to walk all the way back, thank God. Floor 9 was more of the same. The enemies were starting to get really tanky though, and although they were not really doing much to me, it was more just taking longer to kill them, which I'd rather have that over them killing me, thank you very much. Floor 10 is apparently the final floor of the game, and While it was nice being so close to the end, I did have to deal with spider enemies again, and they were just as annoying as the jerks from earlier, if anything even more so since they had more health. Although I guess these enemies are called driders, so they're not technically the same, but still, felt similar enough. After a lot of wandering around and activating switches and looking at teleporters, I finally found the final door I had to go through to come face to face with the final boss. Unfortunately though, it was locked. Just great. I had to take a special teleporter back to floor 5 again and get permission to enter a special dungeon, which would provide me with the final key. Thankfully, this dungeon was short, so I didn't have much to explore, and even more thankfully, this was probably the coolest part of the game for me, because I entered the middle room and immediately got drawn into a fight with what seriously had to be 20 to 30 enemies. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's a lot of enemies. Why was this cool? Well, keep in mind those magic spells I talked about earlier, and the fact that I have 2 wizards. I let loose some fireballs and snowstorms and watched as these enemies got absolutely obliterated by my magic. It was so cool seeing so many numbers pop up on screen, and just thinking about how rough the early part of this game was and seeing me completely being on the opposite side of that struggle now. There were still some stragglers that survived my initial magic blasts, including some more of those damn driders as well, but my team was awesome and we were able to pick off the rest of the guys no problem. Our reward for beating this fight was the Xanathar key, the key that would open the final door of the game. We healed up, opened the door, and faced the Eye of the Beholder. And let me tell you, this fight was a breeze. There were only 3 targets to aim for, and I had 6 warriors that were ready for an absolute beatdown. Slimbo and Bear were swinging on the front lines, Knucklebone and Jaguar were casting from the back, JP and Rain were there for moral and heal support, and before we knew it, the Beholder was down, and the game was finally over. Game complete. Wow, what an experience we had here. I'll say, despite a really rough beginning, I kinda started appreciating the game a little by the end of it. Now, don't get me wrong, this game still has a lot of problems with it. It's very ambitious, and while the things that work do work quite nicely from a D&D perspective, they did not have to go so hard with it. And if anything, I kinda wish they would have deviated a bit from the core mechanics of D&D to focus on a more video game appropriate experience. What I mean by this is the game didn't have to focus so hard on emulating Dungeons & Dragons down to a T. Just have the core ideas and classes involved, and emulate a gameplay system around that where people who don't play D&D can understand what's going on and don't need a manual or guidebook to look up information. There's just so much here that isn't explained, and so much that is practically unnecessary. More than half of the traits, skills, or spells weren't even used, and a large part of that was just because the guides I read said there was literally no reason to focus on those things anyway, and that it only would have hindered me if I did. To me, that shows that those things could have just been left out entirely, and the game should have focused more on balancing or expanding the things that did work. This game didn't need to be an exact clone of the whole D&D experience. Just a tribute or dedication, I think, would have been fine enough. Something to give players maybe an introduction to the world, a taste if you will, and if they enjoyed what they experienced, then maybe they could look into doing some actual D&D. Hey, you never know. Also, accuracy percentages needed to be buffed here. I get that your attack chance depends on dice rolls, so it shouldn't be a guarantee or anything, but I swear, the number of successful attacks in this playthrough, across all allies and enemies, had to be lower than 40%, and that is not good. The game's already pretty slow, and getting slowed down by multiple turns of both sides missing constantly is not fun, and you should never sacrifice fun for authenticity in a video game, ever. Also, I didn't talk about it much, again because there was a lot to go over here, but the game's presentation was also quite lacking. The visuals weren't too bad. Not the worst we've seen so far on this system, but it's not winning any visual excellence awards, that's for sure. And for music and sound quality, well, let's just say that aside from the opening and closing of the game, there's not really any music here. So much of the game is silent atmosphere, and that was definitely a turnoff for so many people in my chat during this playthrough. There are some fun jingles and sound effects though, especially the sound of your allies getting hit with attacks. And some of the enemies as well. But I wouldn't say they really make up for a general lack of music though, as that is pretty bad, not gonna lie. For enjoyability, I gave this a 2 out of 5. I will give the game some credit. Towards the end, it was feeling more like a 3 or maybe even a 3.5, but I can't excuse the massive flaws of this game. It needed way more beginner-friendly explanations or demonstrations along the way, and I didn't feel comfortable playing this until I got quite a bit of outside information. And not just from outside the game, but also outside any resources that came with this game as well. And I think that's a bit inexcusable. You should never have an assumed level of knowledge before playing a video game, and I think there was too much of that happening here. For difficulty, I landed on a 4 out of 5. Once I figured out everything, it was a breeze, but it took a lot to get to that point. Not to mention, there is some RNG involved, not just with attacks landing, but also with stuff like resting in an unsafe area to heal up when you are badly hurt. Getting surprise attacked or screwed over by those factors can really be stressful and cause a lot of anxiety, because it feels like you literally have no control over your success or safety when that happens. But yeah, that was my experience of beating Dungeons & Dragons: Eye of the Beholder. It was an interesting adventure, and one I don't regret having. It has actually gotten me interested a little more in D&D, but maybe not to an extreme amount. I definitely could see myself playing a session or two with my good friend Odinspec, which, again, major thanks to the guy for helping me out with this one. It really made this a lot more tolerable. Now, there are no more Dungeons & Dragons games for this system though, so this was a one-and-done deal at the end of the day. So, I guess we can put a close to the D&D handbook and put this phenomenon to rest for GB Ace. Anyway, here's a sneak peek of the next game we'll be completing for this challenge. Okay guys, thank you for watching this summary. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a comment and or like on the video, as those will really help me in these videos out. And stay tuned for future summaries of this series. If you also want to watch full playthroughs of these games for this challenge, check out the video description for a full playlist of everything that's been uploaded and exported so far. And if you're curious about what I'm playing right now for the challenge, be sure to stop by my Twitch channel to see what my current progress is. Just be warned, I'll be a lot further ahead of where we are for these summaries, so keep that in mind. This has been SlimKirby in the GBA series, and I'll talk to you fine people next time. Later, folks.